Is the thing being projected? Yes? What? Okay. Thank you very much for coming. Before I start the slide presentation, it's important for me to put things into context. You would have heard the Prime Minister in one of his addresses mention that here in St. Kitts, we had a simple four-prong approach to this, the management of this virus, cognizant of the fact that the World Health Organization said there was no one-size-fits-all approach. And so while we were following the guidelines of the World Health Organization, every country had to cut their garments to the cloth that they had. And our approach was very simple. One, to keep the virus at bay as long as possible, and we were successful at doing that, in that the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis was one of the last places on the face of the earth, outside of Antarctica, where the virus crossed its shores. Second, once the virus got to the Federation, our plan was to contain the virus, therefore limiting hospitalizations and deaths and avoiding community spread. And you know that we are one of the few places also that has 0 deaths, and the few hospitalizations we had were out of an abundance of caution. So we had no major hospitalizations and we had no community spread. The third leg of the journey was to make sure that we limit the time before the vaccine became available and community spread, knowing that community spread would be inevitable once the virus was circulating. And we wanted to make sure that that gap was as narrow as possible. And we were actually successful in that we started our vaccination program yesterday, and as yet we have no community spread. So that gap was 0. And the fourth and final leg of the journey is to make sure we attain herd immunity by immunizing persons in the Federation. We know that there are a lot of questions to be asked. We know that there is vaccine hesitancy out here, and we're hoping that through this discourse, we can address most of those issues. It's important for us to have a historical perspective, however, in that in 1760, more than 400,000 Europeans were dying each year from smallpox. And a rumor started that dairy workers, persons who were working with cows, were not dying from smallpox. And there's a surgeon by the name of Jenner who decided to listen to this rumor. And sometimes it's important for you to listen to rumors. And he decided to investigate it and realized that the farm workers who were working with the cows, they were previously infected with a virus that was similar to smallpox called cowpox, giving them minor symptoms. And because of that, they were protected. And with that information, he proceeded to inoculate children with the cowpox vaccine, making sure they were exposed to the cowpox vaccine, thereby stemming the tide of death. And so the first vaccinations basically started in 1760. So we are not reinventing the wheel when we speak about vaccinations to control disease. So what is a vaccination? It's a simple and safe and effective way of protecting people against harmful diseases before they come into contact with them. It uses your body's natural defenses to build resistance to specific infections and make your immune system stronger. And the vaccines train your immune system so that when you're exposed to the disease, you can mount a response against it almost immediately. The vaccines are safe in that they generally contain either a killed or attenuated or weakened form of the virus or germ, so that you don't necessarily develop any significant complications when they're given. And they are usually given either by injection orally or spray in the nose. Now, as I look around this room here, I see some of my classmates from many years ago who didn't take their vaccination, not because they didn't believe in vaccinations, but they were afraid of needles. And so sometimes persons choose not to have the vaccination just because of a fear of needle. I can tell you that I had my vaccination yesterday. I barely felt the injection. These needles are so small, etc. Now I see Leswell shaking his head too. Yeah, okay. And so even if you have a fear of needles, the needle is so small that you would not have any problems there. Now, why is it important to be vaccinated? Today, there are vaccines available to protect against at least 20 different diseases, including pertussis, tetanus, polio, and measles. And vaccines save up to 3 million lives each year. When we get vaccinated, we're not just protecting ourselves, but those around us, because it is not everyone who can take a vaccine. There are some persons, for example, the very young, babies, the very old and frail, who cannot take the vaccine, and they depend on us to get immunized so that we don't spread the germs to them. And so when you go and you roll your sleeve up and take this vaccination, you are not just doing good to yourself, but to the weaker ones among us, okay? When I say weaker in terms of immune system and their health conditions. Now, as I said, we're not reinventing the wheel, because there are a number of diseases that we use vaccines against already. And some of them you recognize, they're cholera, diphtheria, hepatitis, polio, rabies, tetanus, etc. And the reason why vaccinations are important, imagine right now, okay, let's say in the United States, they have over 500,000 persons who are dead now from COVID-19. If there were not any vaccinations, imagine fighting COVID-19 in addition to fighting polio, mumps, measles, rubella. You can imagine the disruption in the entire world that would occur if we chose not to take the vaccinations. And so, despite that, I'm actually surprised when some persons choose not to take the vaccination. It's important for us to understand then what is the concept of herd immunity, because you keep hearing us speak about this all the time. When a person gets vaccinated against a disease, their risk of infection is reduced, so they are also less likely to transmit the virus or bacteria to others. As more people in the community get vaccinated, fewer people remain vulnerable, and therefore there's a less chance of the pathogen spreading from one person to the other. And so by increasing the number of persons in a community who are vaccinated, we basically decrease the risk of the virus spreading. So for example, if every person at our ports of entry were vaccinated, even if they came in contact with the tourist who is coming in with the virus, they're not going to take it home, because there is a protection there at our borders. So herd immunity is the indirect protection from an infectious disease that happens when immunity develops in a population, either through vaccination or through previous infection. It's important for you to know, though, that when you have a disease that is highly infectious and deadly, you do not want to get herd immunity via infection. In the past, for example, chickenpox persons will have parties for children to come and get over it, because it was thought that it's better for you to get it when you were a child as opposed to an adult. But, and that can work for a disease that is not highly lethal. But a disease like COVID-19, you have to get to herd immunity via immunization, not by infection, because too many persons will die, and the question is, who would we want to sacrifice on the altar? You, your mother, your father? No. Okay, so how many vaccines are there, and are we concerned about the speed at which they are being developed? Now, there are currently 60 COVID-19 vaccine trials going on, but there are just a few leading candidates that received emergency use authorization. And as a matter of fact, in the pre-clinical trial, that is in the animal models, there are over 200 trials going on right now. And basically, if we're starting with over 200 vaccine trials, and only about 5, 6, 7 of them are being used in human beings, you understand the stringent protocols and procedures that have to go in place before these vaccines get into persons' arms. And so we are assured that once a vaccine is given emergency use authorization, that it is essentially safe. And the World Health Organization works in collaboration with a number of other agencies to ensure that these vaccines, when they come on the market, they're safe. Prior to the COVID-19 vaccine, the last vaccine that was to be developed at record speed was the measles vaccine that took about 5 years. Now, because the powers that be realized that the only how we're going to get out of this pandemic is through a vaccine, they pumped billions of dollars into the development of the vaccine. And also with the advance in technology, that is why we saw the emergence of the vaccines within a year. But it was not because of any shortcuts. And it's important for you to know that a person is more likely to be seriously harmed by the disease than by a vaccine. And even if you survive disease, there is something now that's called long COVID, where persons continue to have chronic symptoms that can go on for years, because this disease just started last December. And so we don't even know how long this will continue, because the last paragraph is not written as yet on the disease. Now, so we spoke about the vaccines, and it's important for us to be aware of what are the common vaccines that are available. The two that came on board were the Pfizer-BioNTech and the Moderna, and these are mRNA vaccines. This is a technology that was never used before, because generally what we did in the past was to inject a killed or modified version of the virus into the person, and they will mount an immune response. However, every single protein in your body is coded for by some proteins that are called messenger RNA. And what this technology does, they inject the messenger RNA that codes for the spike protein into the human beings. And it directs the cells to produce the spike protein on your cells, and your body would identify that as a foreign COVID-19 virus cell and mount antibodies. And so the second time when you become infected with the virus, you will mount an immune response to get rid of it. And so that's the theory behind the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. And they have efficacies of over 95%, and they're given 21 and 28 days apart. The Pfizer-BioNTech is recommended for persons 16 years and older, and the Moderna for persons 18 years and older. The problem with these two vaccines is that they require ultra-cold storage. And once you have a vaccine that requires ultra-cold storage, it limits the ability for you to transport this vaccine. Because we're not just talking about immunizing first world countries. We're talking about immunizing persons all around the world. Because the World Health Organization recognizes, and you should too, that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And so we need to make sure that every single country on the face of the earth have access to the vaccine. So imagine you having to have a freezer that goes down to -70 to immunize somebody way out in the boondocks, even in Canada, okay, or in Africa, or in Sandy Point. It will create some challenges there, because the refrigerator temperature goes down to 2 to 6 degrees. And so you would need to have a special freezer for these. And so while these vaccines have good efficacy, they are not vaccines that would be available for the everyday person. Now, next we had the University of Oxford Astrazeneca Vaccine, and this is an inactivated adenovirus vaccine. And basically what it is, they got a cold vaccine, and they changed it, put the DNA material of the COVID-19 virus into this virus and inject it into you, and then you would mount an immune response when you become infected with the COVID-19 virus. It offers very good efficacy. The protection is between 70 to 90%. And it requires 2 doses that are given 12 weeks apart, and is indicated for persons over the age of 18. And it has been specifically studied in persons over the age of 65, and so it can be used for the elderly. The caveat with this, though, is that if you have somebody who is very old, and apologies for those persons in here who are over the age of 80, but this is just a medical definition. If you're over the age of 80 and frail and has multiple medical conditions, it is recommended that we consult your doctor before giving you the vaccination, okay? And you can see it is stored at 2 to 6 degrees, which is refrigerator temperature, and it can be stored for up to 6 months. Now, the vaccine that we rolled out yesterday is the Astrazeneca vaccine. And what you have to understand that a number of these biotechnological companies have a number of different places where they either source products or manufacture their vaccines. And so, although the vaccine was developed at Oxford University, they have a manufacturing site in India. And the site that they use is the Serum Institute of India. Now, the Serum Institute of India has been in existence since 1966, and it is responsible for more than 65% of the vaccines that are produced globally, including the ones that we know about, mumps, measles, rubella, etc. It's also thought that more than 2/3 of the children of this world would have received vaccines from the Serum Institute of India. And so when you went to school and the nurses showed up with their little kits and gave you the jab in the arm, you were actually getting vaccines that were most likely produced from the Serum Institute of India. And this is a highly reputable company, and it is authorized by the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization is actually using the Astrazeneca vaccine manufactured at the Serum Institute of India for their COVAX program to get mass vaccination throughout the world. And so when you hear people saying, oh, it was made in India, well, you would prefer it was made in Mother England? I mean, what is the difference? It is the same chemical process that is involved. And so that's a very myopic, colonialistic view of looking at the vaccine, okay? And so we have to understand that the Serum Institute of India, it is the world's largest producer of vaccine. It produces more than 1.6 billion doses of vaccines that are distributed throughout the world. And so there's no other institution on the face of the earth that produces and exports to places all around the world more than the Serum Institute of India. Moving on. Now, there is a lot of hope for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and I'll tell you some more about this. Okay, this has not been given emergency use authorization as yet, but it's thought to be effective against the new variants compared to other vaccines. And it does not require any special ultra storage to keep it. It can be stored in the refrigerator for up to 3 months. And the effectiveness is about 66% overall. The good thing about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is that it has a great effect in terms of limiting hospitalization and death to up to 85%, and it only requires 1 shot. And so everybody, for example, who got their shot yesterday, who got their shots today, they would have to come back in 10 weeks. If you have a vaccine that requires just 1 shot, then you know that the person is complete. And so there's a lot of hope resting on this if it gets emergency use authorization for rollout in a number of other third world countries to ensure that people get vaccinated in a very efficient way. Now, this brings me to vaccine efficiency, because there are some persons who will look at the Pfizer vaccine and say, well, okay, it is 95% effective. And we said that the AstraZeneca vaccine is 83.4% effective. So they will say, I want to get the Pfizer, which is 95% effective. Vaccine efficacy is the percentage reduction in disease incidence in a vaccinated group compared to the unvaccinated group in clinical trials. Okay, and so the figures when we speak about the vaccine efficacy, we are talking about what the results showed in the clinical trials. Now, many clinical trials have what's called exclusion criteria, because when you're testing a vaccine, you want to make sure that you do the test in persons who are relatively healthy. And so they would exclude young children. And that is why, for example, these vaccines are not indicated for persons below the age of 16 or 18. It is not that, it is thought now that they would be harmful to these persons, but the initial tests were not carried out in these persons. They carried them out in persons who were older and healthier. And so the exclusion criteria are usually age, pregnancy, or particular health conditions, because you're not going to go and test the vaccine in somebody who is 85 with serious heart problems, kidney problems, etc. Because just by getting a fever, you can tip the person over the edge. Now, the ideal conditions of a clinical trial do not reflect what happens in the real world. And you could have seen that, for example, in the vaccine rollout we had yesterday. We have persons there of different size, shape, age, etc. Okay? And so this brings us to vaccine effectiveness. And the vaccine effectiveness tells us how well a vaccine works under real-world conditions once people are outside of the clinical trials. And how effective the vaccine will be will also depend on how many persons who are covered. Now, there are a number of other things that will affect the the effectiveness of vaccine. It depends on the age, whether or not the person has major illnesses, previous exposure, the time since vaccination, etc. And of course, we've all heard about variants and the development of new variants. And so it's important also for us to know what is a variant, and are we surprised about the development of variants. Now, when a virus makes copies of itself, it sometimes changes a little. And when I say that, when you become infected with the virus, it makes other little viruses, and that's how you become sick, because the virus is actually multiplying within you. And once the virus is circulating, the virus will have a number of different changes until eventually you might have a dominant strain that develops, which is called a variant. Now, the reason why the virus does this, because the virus wants to be able to adapt to its environment. And so the variants either have a change in transmissibility, which means an increase in the way the virus spreads, or increase in the severity of transmission. Now, initially, a number of these variants were shown to have an increased transmissibility, but not an increase in severity of the disease. But even if a virus had increased transmissibility, that can lead to an overwhelming of your health system, because if more persons are coming down with illnesses, then it means more persons will be presenting to the hospital. And so they go hand in hand. We learned about the new variants, the UK, the South African, and the Brazilian variant, and that is why we issued the advisories about travel from these places. Now, again, making the point about vaccine efficacy, it's important for you to know that very few vaccines reach 100% efficacy. For example, the flu vaccine varies from efficacy from as low as 10% in 2004 to as high as 60% in 2010. And generally, the efficacy of the flu vaccine is between 40 to 60%. Yet, millions of persons take it every year, and millions of lives are saved each year by taking the flu vaccine. So one doesn't necessarily have to reach an efficacy of 100% for the flu vaccine to be effective. Last year, there are a number of persons, I'm pretty certain some persons in this room took the flu vaccine, not realizing that the efficacy last year was 45%, okay? And we're saying that the Astrazeneca vaccine is over 80%. Now, if we look at some of the vaccines that we have taken, you know, you see the measles, mumps, rubella, the efficacy against measles 93%, mumps 78%, and rubella 97%. And after the second dose, the mumps vaccine efficacy jumps to 88%, never crossing 90. But we have eliminated mumps here in St. Kitts and across the globe. And so you don't necessarily have to have an efficacy of over 90% for you to eliminate a disease. It depends on the number of persons who are taking the vaccine. So there are very few vaccines that reach close to 100% efficacy. Now, so the question is asked, who will be vaccinated first? And the World Health Organization provided guidelines for determining who are vaccinated first. But it's important for us to remember, again, we said that there was no one-size-fits-all. And so the approach from the World Health Organization was based on a number of goals. And I'll tell you what these goals were. Number one, one second. Yeah. The first was to decrease death and serious disease as much as possible. Second was to preserve function in society. And so for you to preserve function in society, you need to make sure that essential workers are immunized. And the last goal was to reduce the extra burden COVID-19 is having on people already facing disparities. So we're talking about the underprivileged, because the underprivileged who are living in overcrowding conditions, they will more likely have the virus spreading rampant in their community than you who are living in a house where you have to make a cell phone call to call your child from the kitchen. Okay. So the phased rollout guidelines from the World Health Organization, they spoke about healthcare personnel and persons in long-term care facility. But you will see our program, when the CMO speaks about it, will be slightly different. Because since we do not have community spread, we don't have to go into the caring home and start immunizing those persons. We will be focusing on showing up our borders, the persons who are more likely to be exposed to the virus if the virus comes into our country. The next would be frontline essential workers and people 75 years and older, because these are more likely to suffer from hospitalization and disease. And the third would be people between the age of 64 and 74, and also those between the age of 16 or 18 and 64 with underlying conditions. Now, the ultimate goal really is to have everyone immunized. But we need to understand that while we work towards rolling out a safe and effective vaccine program, we must continue the essential public health actions to suppress transmission and decrease mortality. Now, some persons ask, should the vaccine be mandatory? And I'm glad that we have the Attorney General here. To be properly protective, COVID-19 vaccine needs to be given to most persons, if not everyone. It is only through widespread vaccination we will reach herd immunity. And so you understand persons have a personal responsibility to take this. And that's one of the reasons why we are having these sessions, so we can allay any doubts. Being vaccinated, we know, dramatically reduces the risk of seriously harming or killing others. So you're not just protecting yourself, but you're protecting others. And one of the things that I say all the time is this: if I were to take a gun and shoot someone, you will see the direct effect of my action right there. The person drops down, okay? But you breach quarantine and go and spread the virus, okay, at a nightclub or a bar. It's 2 weeks later, the effects would be occurring from your action, and you'll be long removed from the incident. But you're just as guilty as the person who took a gun and shot someone. And so that is why it's important for us to understand that we're all in this fight together, and every single thing we do will help us to get out of this. Now, and the benefits then of being vaccinated will come at a minimal cost or zero cost, because the vaccine is free here, okay? And it will come at a significant cost to, minimal cost to society, because it is only through the vaccine that we can open up. Now, persons have to understand, though, however, that if you don't do this and we have community spread, we will have to have a lockdown, and lockdowns are mandatory, and they come at significant individual costs and social costs. And so when you are vacillating as to whether or not you should take the vaccine, you have to think about, will I prefer a mandatory lockdown, or will I voluntarily move forward and get the vaccine to make sure that we can get back to some sense of normalcy? And so we believe that we can achieve herd immunity through less restrictive alternatives, and it's important for us to have this campaign then, and we're hoping that you can be messengers. So we finish educating and giving you the information here, and you go out to make sure that more persons take the information out. Now, another question that is asked is, if I get the vaccine and travel to St. Kitts, will I still need to quarantine? Now, it's important for you to understand that if you get vaccinated, you may still transmit the virus, because while you're mounting your response, you can still be multiplying virus in your nostrils, and you can cough or sneeze and spread it to someone. The good news about Astrazeneca is that it has shown now to decrease the incidence of viral transmission, which means that, and studies have shown that after the first shot of the Astrazeneca vaccine, your risk of transmitting the virus to someone else decreases by 67%. So you can see the vaccine we have has a great potential, once we achieve herd immunity, for us to even look at lessening some of our restrictive protocols for entry and moving around in the country. And so everything, again, in terms of us getting back to some sense of normalcy, depend on you. Some persons also ask is, if I had COVID-19 infection already, do I still need to be vaccinated? And the guideline is that the vaccine should be offered regardless as to whether or not you had COVID-19 infection. However, it is advised that if you are currently infected, you should wait until you recover. We also know that persons who were previously infected, they have some degree of immunity for up to 90 days after. And so if we're in a situation where vaccinations are limited, you will put the persons who were previously infected a little bit on the back of the line and vaccinate those who are basically virgin territory. Another question that is asked is it recommended for pregnant women? Now, pregnant women who contract the virus, they have an increased risk of poor outcome. And the World Health Organization advises that those who are at risk of contracting the virus through work or having underlying health conditions which predispose them to developing complications should take the vaccine. What we are recommending here in the Federation is that we would not routinely give the vaccine to pregnant women. And so if you have a pregnant person who is working at your establishment and they're at increased risk because they're working at the port, they're cashing and coming to contact with a number of other persons, it is recommended that you move them into a protective place in your job site, working in the back, you know, behind the computer, away from someone, so that they would not be at increased risk for developing any COVID-19 infection. Now, I'm coming to the end, and the question is sometimes asked, how quickly will this vaccine end the pandemic? And the impact of COVID-19 vaccines on the pandemic will depend on several factors. And these include the effectiveness of the vaccine, and we know that we have a very effective vaccine that we are rolling out here in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. It all depends on how quickly other vaccines are approved and delivered into the arms of the public. And so we're not just talking about us here, because we're not safe until our neighbors are safe. And so the more effective vaccines that come on board and make sure that the entire world is vaccinated, then the safer we will be. And also, how many people get vaccinated, and this comes down again to the individual. And this is the first time in our history that the singular action of an individual can have far-reaching consequences for all of us. And so we encourage you to speak to everyone and make sure that we push towards mass vaccination, because we know that vaccine saves lives, and complacency and inaction is just as deadly as the virus itself. Okay? And so I thank you for listening.